The Ardennes region of Belgium was the scene of one of the most brutal and bloody battles of World War II. There, Hitler made his last great attempt to conquer Europe with a complex and secret strategy that caused the death of almost 40,000 soldiers in the course of a few days. The forest land was watered with the blood of young Americans and Germans who gave their lives for a greater cause. In this new installment of military history, we are going to review that event based on the experience of a group of American tankers who were stranded behind enemy lines. How did they survive the Nazi siege? Stay with us to find out. In December 1944, optimism reigned in the Allied High Command, and this was more than understandable. In the last few months, they had managed to enter German soil, conquering important points in Europe such as Aachen and Antwerp. Finally, the landing in Normandy, in the north of France, had opened a new front that bled the Nazi enemy dry and allowed the Allied troops to advance steadily towards the heart of the Reich. As a symbol of this favorable wind, Paris was liberated in August 1944. The Americans held a triumphal parade and then continued their work on the front. The pincers were tightening ever more on Hitler's empire, but the beasts never die without giving a last and bloody battle. The Führer had hopes of being able to give an unexpected setback to the conflict with a masterstroke in an area of great strategic value. The offensive was intended to retake part of the lost territory in Belgium and southern Holland by means of a surprise attack in the weakly defended Ardennes region, which the Germans had already entered in 1940 during the conquest of France. The German leader was certain that it was possible to defeat the transatlantic enemy, not only by pure strategy, but also by racial superiority.
When Hitler looks at the battlefield, ideology clearly plays a role. He doesn't look at the US Army as some huge conquering force. He sees it as a mongrel army of different races and ethnicities. And in Hitler's racial worldview, that's a real weakness.
First, it was necessary to deceive the Allies about the movements of the Nazi troops, so false messages were sent in the knowledge that they would be intercepted by the enemy, who believed that there were only 4 German divisions in the Ardennes instead of the 25 ready for the assault. The date chosen for the attack was December 16th, when it was expected that there would be cover from a snowstorm that would keep the vastly superior enemy air force on the ground. In addition, as a preliminary step, groups of English-speaking Nazis dressed in British and American uniforms were infiltrated, whose mission was to seize the bridges and spread false information about when the attack would begin. The offensive in the Ardennes had been carefully planned by the High Command of the Third Reich, and the fruits of that work were soon to be evident during the first days of the battle. For Germany, the advantages of that territory were many. On the one hand, the harsh winter of 1944 was approaching, which was combined with the scarce presence of Allied troops in the region. To give you a concrete idea of how poorly manned that line was, the bulk of the soldiers belonged to the American 4th Division, which had only half of its troops. In other words, it was the weakest link in the Allied chain, and Hitler was clear about it. For the Reich, capturing the Ardennes should be the springboard to recover Antwerp and turn the war around 180 degrees. At least that way they would die in glory if the debacle were to materialize. For other Nazi leaders, having that territory in their power could be the mechanism to negotiate a peace with the West, avoiding falling into the hands of their mortal enemies, the Soviets. For this last blow, Hitler gathered 500,000 new soldiers and re-equipped his armored divisions with new Panther, Tiger I, and Tiger II tanks. Four units were selected for the operation. The 6th Panzer Army was chosen for the northern attack, being the northernmost point on the battlefront. This team, created on 24 September 1944, included the most senior and experienced formation of the Waffen-SS. Due to its exceptional capabilities, it was entrusted with the main objective of the campaign, taking Antwerp. On the other hand, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel was chosen for the central attack route with the aim of taking Brussels. Also participating in a secondary role was the 15th Army, commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, stationed at the northern end of the Ardennes battlefield, with the task of holding the American forces there. Finally, the 7th Army, commanded by General Erich Brandenberger, was dedicated to the southernmost attack, taking the southern portion of the front near the Luxembourg town of Echternach. Their mission was to protect that flank at all costs so that the rest of the divisions could operate with peace of mind. The cards were on the table and it was time to start playing. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., the Germans began the assault with a massive artillery barrage over an hour and a half, using 1,600 pieces to cover a front of about 130 kilometers. The initial impression of the Americans was that it was a planned and localized response to a recent Allied attack on the Wallerscheid sector to the north, where the 2nd Infantry Division had made a dent in the Siegfried Line, the defensive border of the Third Reich. But they were wrong. It was the beginning of a large-scale offensive, such as the Führer's men had not carried out for some time. The spearhead of the attack, the 6th Panzer Army, overwhelmed the American troops defending the Ardennes, capturing 7,000 prisoners in a single day. Virtually no one in the Allied command expected a German offensive at this point in the war, when the Third Reich was in retreat. Furthermore, it was a day of terrible weather, and Allied air superiority was therefore not decisive, as the vast majority of their aircraft remained on the ground. This made for an extremely promising start for the German units, although they were aware of the challenge of the operation and were fearful of their fate if they were to succumb. Heavy snowstorms buried parts of the Ardennes region. Although it had the desired effect of keeping the Allied air force on the ground, the weather also caused problems for the Germans because the poor road conditions hampered their advance. Poor traffic control led to long traffic jams and fuel shortages for the forward units. The offensive was also complicated by the poor state of the ground, soaked by recent rains. In 1940, the Germans had managed to cross the area in 3 days, because they had carried out the attack during the spring season, with the sun shining and the path available to cover 80 kilometers a day, as Hitler had calculated. Despite these setbacks, German fury was felt with important victories between 16th and 17th December, 1944. Amidst the chaos, the American troops who had to resist the first days of the offensive were the worst off. They had no accurate information regarding German capabilities and were at a clear disadvantage due to weather conditions. It was then that one of Uncle Sam's tanks strayed from his division and was stranded behind enemy lines, forced to resist the Nazi advance alone. The American soldiers had to use their machine guns and rifles to make their way through a forest infested with German troops eager to annihilate them. It was a confusing time. Behind every tree, there was an enemy waiting for the right moment to attack. Added to this were the complications caused by the weather, as the incessant rains and sporadic snowfalls turned the ground into a quagmire. Each step required a considerable effort, but the uniformed men had to keep their eyes on the trees. That was where the threat was hidden. After some skirmishes, the Allies managed to leave the first wave of Germans behind. Upon reaching a clearing in the heart of the Ardennes, they faced an even worse challenge: the lack of fuel. The tank was dry, and the next refueling point was about a kilometer from their position. It was a tanker truck that had been parked there. 1,000 meters may not seem like much from the comfort of our homes, but in a war context, it is a gigantic distance, even more so when you have to advance carefully and under constant threat from the enemy. With all the odds against them, the American team set out on the journey towards the precious liquid that would give new life to the tank. Upon reaching their objective, they saw a familiar sight. German soldiers tormenting a civilian, a young Belgian woman who had the misfortune of crossing paths with Nazi troops. The Allies had to reveal their position and open fire on the enemy, not only to be able to take control of the truck and the fuel, but also to save the life of the girl who was about to be executed. The shots alerted other Germans nearby, so a brief but dangerous chase through the woods ensued. This time, the Americans had their hands full transporting the precious loot. When they returned to the tank, they had to load it against the clock before the Führer's troops showed up to exact revenge for their dead comrades. Once the tank was moving, the next priority was to escape enemy territory to rejoin the Allied ranks. This was not going to be easy. The Reich had sent almost 500,000 soldiers, so the area was swarming with men loyal to Hitler and his megalomaniacal cause. After wandering for a few hours, the American tankers came across a farm that had been razed to the ground by the SS. The bodies of tortured civilians lay on the ground, the blood still fresh. The perpetrators of this massacre were still there, and the American team was not going to let them escape after such a display of cruelty. The firefight was intense, but the Allies managed to overcome the SS officers. Annihilating these Germans was important, not only to avenge the pain of the peasants who had just been riddled with bullets, but also to keep the presence of the missing tankers secret. A single living German could contact the bulk of his comrades so that they could undertake a search operation. In that case, they would be found and executed almost immediately. At this point, the group decided to split into two. The tank, with its crew inside, headed towards the open field, risking detection, but with the chance of making contact with their division again. Another part of the team continued on foot through the most wooded part of the Ardennes, hoping that the dense vegetation and ancient trees would serve as cover for their stealthy escape. The soldiers said goodbye with the promise of meeting again soon, in the safety of their own territory. For most of the journey, the men on foot's plan worked. However, their path crossed with that of a small Nazi convoy heading towards the front lines. Although the Americans were able to escape this close encounter with death, their bodies were already tired and worn out by the action. It was necessary to return to their comrades, and to do so, they intruded into a German position where they managed to steal a transport vehicle with machine guns and other high-caliber platforms. As they escaped aboard the machine, they were detected by SS officers who pursued them along winding roads. When all seemed lost, air reinforcements arrived in the area to unleash Allied fury on the Germans. The weather had delayed the takeoff of the American aircraft, but after a reasonable time, they were able to make use of this trump card that allowed them to annihilate the Nazi divisions that were operating in the Ardennes. This is how the group of tankers was able to survive their journey through enemy lines during the bloodiest battle of 1944. What we have just narrated is not a historical fact, but a combination of true stories that contributed to the plot of the film Fury in the Bulge, by director Joseph J. Lawson, released in 2014, exactly 70 years after that offensive. It serves as a tribute to the men who gave their lives on Belgian soil, but also as a trigger to analyze what happened there. It should be noted that it is a free adaptation of the facts, since the film is set in a period of heavy spring rains, and the battle took place during the harsh European winter. Even so, Fury in the Bulge portrayed the sacrifices made by the Allied front. Let's return to the history books to learn how Hitler's plan developed and how successful it was. Despite being taken by surprise by the attacks in Belgium on December 16, 1944, the American High Command rose to the occasion and, without losing their cool, ordered their forces to concentrate on the city of Bastogne. That point was the most important crossroads in the Ardennes, so controlling it implied an enormous tactical advantage. Defending that position would force the Germans to move slowly along secondary roads, which would allow the Allies to bring in reinforcements from various parts of the front. The only divisions available to defend Bastogne were the 82nd and 101st Airborne. Despite organizational shortcomings, and with little ammunition and food, they were launched against the German advance. Luckily for the Allies, these D-Day veterans knew their job well, so they dug a ring of trenches around the city against which the Nazi offensive crashed. Firmly entrenched, the Americans established numerous field hospitals and warehouses in Bastogne, reserving their artillery shells to put out of action the panzers assigned to the siege. As the days passed, German attacks were limited to a few sorties a day, and relying on air supplies. The general in charge, Anthony McAuliffe, refused to surrender. Unable to defeat them, the Third Reich force surrounded Bastogne in order to continue its advance. Completely isolated from the rest of the army, the Americans resisted without warm clothing in the frozen forests, subjected to heavy bombardment and constant attacks by the German Air Force, which took to the air as soon as the storm abated on December 21st. With clear skies, the Allied front regained the initiative, disputing control of the airspace from the Germans, and using the same C-47 planes used by the paratroopers to drop hundreds of tons of supplies on them, without which the defense would have been impossible. Now we will see material recorded during these clashes. The improvement in the weather from the 23rd onwards allowed the United States to counter the offensive by bombing the front and supply lines, which, combined with the arrival of reinforcement divisions, halted the German advance near the Meuse River. Another decisive factor in the Nazi defeat was the lack of fuel, as, although they had formidable Tiger and Panther tanks, their crews abandoned them when they ran out. Gradually, the Allies gained the upper hand in the fighting and began to retake the lost ground. General Patton was tasked with going to the aid of Bastogne with his tanks, and after a series of hard battles, he managed to break the siege on December 26th. The Wehrmacht attempted to restore the situation on January 1st with a combined Luftwaffe army attack along the entire front. But during the first offensive, lost 277 aircraft in a futile attempt to destroy enemy air bases. The second advance was firmly repulsed by Allied infantry, dashing any hope of German victory on Belgian soil. In the face of defeat, many experienced German units were severely depleted in men and equipment as survivors retreated to the Siegfried Line defenses. for the Americans, with some 610,000 men involved and some 89,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest of the Second World War. For the German side, out of 500,000 troops, 85,000 were recorded as killed, wounded, or captured. This is how Adolf Hitler's empire of terror struck its final blow, in a desperate attempt to regain control over Europe. While the events in the film Fury and the Bulge are fiction, its spirit reflects the hell that hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers went through as they resisted the final onslaught of the Third Reich. This is how we come to the end of the video. If you like this content and want to learn more about surprising events from the past, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.